By my watch, it's 4:20 or 3:20. Sorry. So it's time for us to get started with Sunset 4. If someone wouldn't mind pulling the back doors closed. As you may notice, we're down a chair. Due to the intricacies of the new scheduling system, Mark is double booked, so I am chairing this one on my own. So I beg your understanding there. If you haven't seen it yet this week, this is the note well. It looks the same as it has in every other working group you've been in. You should read it at some point and understand what it means. This might not be that time. We do need, we have a JabberScribe volunteer. We do still need a note taker. We can't really go on until we get one, so we get to sit in uncomfortable silence until someone volunteers. Or I can volunteer someone. Dave, would you mind taking notes? Yeah, that's a good point. Can we get more than one person to help out with notes since we're using Etherpad? That way, when Dave's talking, it doesn't get lost. Yeah, I will be happy to leave it up there for a moment. If we could get one more volunteer to sort of help out with notes, please. Thank you. So if you just both go into the that link there, it's a collaborative note-taking system. So. You got it?
The door? Yeah.
No, the. Okay, cool. So I will start the blue sheets around. Please sign them. Who yelled at me with IPR? Okay, so agenda for today. I don't expect a lot of bashing because there's not a lot that needs to move around. We're kind of recovering this working group from a sleep state because we had a couple of meetings where we didn't have Sunset 4 meetings and there hasn't been a lot of activity on the list. And so basically what we're looking at here is a couple of our drafts that are currently working group drafts, kind of looking at what needs to happen in order to get those back moving again. One of the things that's happened is that Simone Perel, who is our one of our primary authors and editors for at least one, if not both of these drafts, has changed roles in his day job and doesn't have the time to contribute to this in the way that he was before. And so JF has agreed to kind of help out as an editor in these documents, and so he's going to be doing a lot of the talking today about those two drafts. And then the other half of this meeting, we really want to spend some time talking about how we continue to make forward progress on the working group itself. Talk about future work if we think there's future work to undertake beyond these two drafts. And also sort of gauge interest on the working group. Do we need to continue, and do we have the people that are willing to contribute to reviewing documents, writing documents, and participating on, especially on the mailing list, in order to help us make forward progress there. So I think at this point, Jay, if you want to come up and talk about gap analysis draft. I can do it this way if you'd like. Is that big enough for you?
Jeff Tremblay, Videotron, Virginie. So I'm not an author of gap analysis actually, but I've been helping for the last step of that document. Actually, it was almost ready to publish. It seemed pretty stable. Some text suggested by Lee Howard was added in there that was related to draft Georgia IPv6 support. So basically, that text says that we should do a review of the existing IRC and basically figure out if there's anything that would prevent a proper IPv4 sunset in the existing specifications. So this document, the gap analysis, is almost ready for last call, unless someone suggests that it's not ready or there's something missing. So the next step would be what has been suggested is maybe having this document reviewed by people who actually do IPv6 only deployment and getting their feedback if there's any gap in the gap analysis, basically. But besides that, it would be ready for last call. Any question, comment on gap analysis and its possible last call?
And I'd like to try and get a couple of volunteers to make a good substantive review of the document. We've had folks do that in the past, but I think that would be a good step in terms of sort of getting this back moving again. So is there folks willing to volunteer to read and review the document and post the review to the list? And your name for the minutes?
My name is
Mukong?
Any other volunteer?
Thank you for that. I don't believe so. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. So no IPv4 have been added as an author on this one. We make several changes. So a lot of addition on that side. We also focused more, following Toronto, on the no IPv4 option for DHCPv6. I think that's one of the direction that was suggested in Toronto. Then there are other things, of course, to add. Looking at the minutes from Toronto, I wasn't there, but a few things I could distill from this discussion. One of them was that we need more use case steps, basically, into IPv4 sunsetting and how this would be used. We don't want an on and off switch, basically something that would turn off IPv4 all of a sudden. Some of the comments that were made was that there are still IPv4 devices active in the home, and even if an ISP does not provide IPv4 anymore, it might be desirable for a lot of people to keep IPv4 running locally. So we want to add these options, different scenarios, and step in the IPv4 sunsetting that would be desirable. So yeah, it's mentioned there, local connectivity is one. One of the questions on that side is, do we want to keep IPv4 link local for that, or do we want, for example, the home router to continue giving out the HTTP/v4 addresses while not having upstream connectivity? Which one is the best option? Yeah, so I think in the last time's minute, we had also some people asked to have more details on the timing and the different steps, so we'll try to include that in the next version of the document as well. There were also some questions about security considerations. Could this be used for attacks? If you have ideas on that side, would be willing to hear them on the list. We heard a few ones so far, especially on arrays that shouldn't be used to carry the no IPv4 option. On the DHCPv6 side, looks like this wouldn't introduce new vectors for security problems. Okay, go on. So yeah, the idea would be to find some middle ground for IPv4 usage, mostly in the home. We haven't found any scenario for the enterprise yet. If you come up with ideas of how v4 could be used in an enterprise scenario locally, I haven't heard any scenario around that, but that might be a possibility. Yeah, there's the manual configuration override as well. What would be the behavior of a router, a home CPE, something off the shelf, or maybe a bit old, that has an option to turn off IPv4? What's the exact behavior that would be expected in that case? We should put that in the document as well. And besides that, it's pretty much that, actually. So basically, if you have scenarios that you want to scene cover in Sunset 4 for either the home, the enterprise, or other scenarios, let us know, and we'll try to add them to the document.
So some of you may remember that this document had a cross review in V6 Ops, and there was a lot of controversy around the original recommendations. And so the most recent version of the draft has changes that incorporate some of the responses from that review in terms of stepping back a little bit from having sort of the kill switch that we were originally talking about here. But I think there probably still needs to be some substantive discussion on the list about how we do some of these things, what's acceptable, what's not. I want to hear that from folks on the list, because what the sense I kind of got in this is that we had a lot of strong opinions but not very much consensus, and I'd like to kind of run that toward consensus in order to get a sense for what it is we actually should be doing, because then at least we can say the working group has discussed this at length and we believe that this is the right way to go, and here are our reasons why. I don't think we were at that point when we asked for the review in V6 Ops before, and that resulted in discussion that was kind of all over the map. It provided us some useful feedback, but I think at this point what we need is for some folks to look at this and see whether or not it's something that they believe is the right course of action, and if not, talk about why they think not, and so that we can actually start having some discussion around how to get this to a point where we feel confident that the working group has consensus behind it, and then we can kind of push this forward again for some additional reviews. So along those lines, I'm looking for volunteers to review this document as well. I might look with care at a couple of the Cable Labs folks in the audience who might be able to provide some guidance on use in the home network. No volunteers at all? Okay, well, we'll ask on the list.
Okay. Anything else? No, the other one is for you, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. So unless there are other questions or comments on the two drafts we were discussing, we can move into the next section of this discussion. In terms of other things that are going on within the working group, there are two other documents that are pending working group adoption right now. We had a charter item that covers carrier-grade NAT port allocation. Originally, we had integrated several drafts together, including one that had some IPR encumbrance. And the last time that we discussed this, the consensus was to remove that and have it be a separate document in order to eliminate any confusion or concern there. That document has been peeled off and is now in the individual submission queue. And so what's remaining is the other non-IPR encumbered CGN port allocation stuff. It looked to me in the previous discussions like this draft was pretty close to being ready for working group adoption at this point. But again, we need an update from the authors and some additional comments on the draft so that we can proceed there. Ted?
Hi, Ted Lemon, probably wearing an AD hat here. So what was the process that you used to separate that out?
Well, the Cable Labs document, the authors that originally wrote that section had originally their own document that talked about a specific port allocation method that had some Cable Labs IPR associated with it. That entire section of the document was removed and put back as its own separate document now. And so the document stands alone with other types of port allocation methods without requiring that one.
Okay.
And so The only thing I do see is that the system still shows it as having an IPR file on it, and I'm not sure entirely
that's why I came up to the mic.
From a machinery perspective how we do that. It might be that we've got to email the secretary and say, hey, this no longer applies.
I think the right way to handle this, because the way that IPR works is kind of a little bit arcane. What I would suggest that you do is actually do a new working group document, or I guess it's still an individual submission. So do an individual submission with a new name and ask the people who submitted the original IPR to look at the document and see if they still want to submit IPR on it. And hopefully the answer will be no, and then you'll be done. Because otherwise, there's no way to just take IPR off a document. Okay. And what you did sounds like it was exactly the right thing to do, but we just need to make sure that everybody agrees it was the right thing to do, and we don't wind up in a, know, because part of the whole IPR, the way we do IPR, is that we don't want people in the IETF deciding deciding what the IPR declaration applies to, which is kind of what's happening here. So that's why I'm proposing this weird transaction.
Okay. I'm thinking maybe the way we'll do it is to actually have it posted as a working group draft, since we were close to adoption anyway.
Yep.
And then once it's posted, we can have that evaluation happen.
You should probably make the name sufficiently different that it doesn't get caught by the replaced by.
Okay.
That's what I was just going to say. You have to make an explicit decision as chairs as to whether it's replaced by or not. And I think Ted's suggestion was change the file name first, then adopt it so that it's such that the new one that's an individual submission is replaced by the working group document, so you have the replaced by history there. I think that was your suggestion, correct?
Actually, that wasn't my suggestion, but that's probably even better. Yeah.
Good guidance, thank you. And then there's a relatively new document dealing with IPv6 only DNS. It's a 00 draft. It needs more reviews. It's fairly limited at this point, but this would be the other document that we would be considering. This is not technically a charter item for us, but I think it fits in the right area of discussion in terms of talking about how you do DNS in either an IPv6 only or an IPv6 only plus transition technology kind of world. But again, these need reviews so that we can make forward progress there. My general thought in terms of the way that the working group has been going is that we've had a number of meetings where we've had pretty good process and pretty good progress and pretty good discussion where we'll present one or more drafts and people will come to the mic and say useful things. But after we leave the meeting, we get basically no discussion on the mailing list at all. Which leads me to believe that we've got a lot of folks that are coming in because Sunset 4 looks mildly interesting, but it's not interesting enough for them to actually sign up on the mailing list and continue participating. In conversations that I've had with the working group chairs and the ADs, the sense we kind of got was that this was a little too far out on the edge because IPv6 only is a pretty new thing for most folks. They're not operating IPv6 only networks, yet they're operating dual stack networks, or they're just now considering rolling out V6, and so this isn't something that people are really thinking about yet, and so people didn't think they could contribute or whatever. But I think in the last 12 to 18 months since we really were thinking about this, there have been enough IPv6 only deployments that this may kind of change now, and we're at a point where we can get some renewed interest. And so, I'd like to get a sense for the room if this is something that you think is something the IETF should continue to work on right now. Is this a problem that we still need to solve? If you're not familiar with what Sunset 4 is intended to do, feel free to go and look on our tools page at the charter. But generally what we're talking about here is both talking about things that might be necessary in order to turn off IPv4 in a network, given that most of the protocols that the IETF has designed were intended to be very robust and very, very resilient. A lot of them don't have off switches per se. And so trying to go in and tell them that there is no IPv4 and there never will be, there are some details to work through around that. And also considering when you're running an IPv6 only network, are there still problems where features are missing in the protocols or other things that don't work properly. It's both a combination of operational considerations and protocol considerations there. And so if this is something you think is important for the IETF to be considering, it would be useful for you to come to the mic and say so. Or if you don't think so, say why.
Lee Howard. I do think this is really important. I think this is actually probably the most important thing IETF is working on. I think it's premature, which is a delightful thing. I think that, yes, there are people deploying IPv6 only networks and segments of networks. They generally appear as walled gardens right now. There are also things that we refer to sometimes as IPv6 only, which are actually native IPv6 plus something with IPv4. Next slide. Right now, I'm not saying to advance. I'm mentioning that that's there. So at worst, I would say I'm okay with going dormant for another meeting or two if we need to, and then coming back and getting some more field experience reports on IPv6 only networks from the field.
So, Dave Taylor, I'm not going to directly answer your question, but I'm going to answer part of, or respond to, or add to, I guess, because I agree with one of Lee's points, which is one of the other benefits that this working group has had, besides the question of how you get to IPv6 only, was specifically the gap analysis document, which I think was the previous slide. Mm-hmm. Okay? And so that benefit is that whenever somebody else comes along that says, I'm going to propose this thing and I'm going to make it be IPv4 only, okay, then we can direct them to this work group and say, either they're doing the wrong thing or there's something that needs to go in the gap analysis document. So as long as we have the gap analysis document that's still open, that's serving a function, which is there anything else that needs to be in there? Because if anybody else is doing something v4 only, then either it's already covered in that document or we've got a gap to add into the gap analysis document. As soon as we declare that we're done with that document, then perhaps going dormant in the hopes that, well, are we done? Well, we don't know until the gaps stop coming, right? And so not closing but going dormant, I think, as Lee suggested, is probably the right thing, and not closing, because it still provides an avenue to say, if somebody else is doing something that's IPv4 only or brings that proposal into the IETF, then we either come back and say, no, you didn't listen, or there's a gap that needs to be added into here, and maybe there's some work there, and at least keeping a mailing list open to collect that sort of stuff and respond to would be beneficial. So that's my opinion.
Okay.
Michael Abrahamson, yeah, I just have to agree that this is important work. I want to be able to provide, have someone show up and not have to give them an IPv4 address, and they then use some kind of translation mechanism in the network in order to reach IPv4 space for services. I want to be able to get away from dual stack as soon as possible, basically, as soon as it's practically feasible with devices and operating systems and so on. So, yeah, we really need this.
Sounds like maybe there's a new volunteer for the gap analysis review. Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the challenges with gap analyses throughout the IETF, really, is that you're putting a static document out for a gap analysis. I mean, in fact, a lot of the text that we added to the gap analysis draft was observing that the IETF has done an IPv6 gap analysis in the past, and that it's sort of sitting and no one really knows whether the gaps are resolved or not, and that there are about 3,000 RFCs, according to the numbering, not in terms of actual numbers of RFCs, that have never been looked at with this context in mind, because that RFC, or that review was done around RFC 3300. And so there's more work to be done there, but, closing out a review and then statically leaving that way, our only real option is to create additional updates for further gaps that are identified, or abyss, or whatever. Sorry.
Okay. David Song from BI, and I'm the author of the Sunset for IPv6 only DNS. The work is a little stark, and because from the very beginning I found the DNS is very how to say, to move to the IPv6 only environment because the application context is independent from the IP layer context. So I start to want to find some problems or some issues related to the deployment of v6 only DNS in the network. Actually, there are some transition technologies have the v6 only DNS functional in its devices, but it's acts in a proxy manner. So that's why the reason I come up with to write down the draft to address some issues. I will continue to working on that part, but I have a question because it is a overlapping topic. One is on v6 and v4, one is on the DNS. So I want to know, is it worthwhile to continue the document in this working group or move to DNS OP working group?
Just only. Well, I believe you might have a more friendly environment to discuss here than in V6 and DNS Ops, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But personally, I read this and I thought it was actually interesting. Once we detail a bit more the steps in V4 sunsetting, I believe that the last step is actually not only removing V4 on the host, but also removing maybe socket access to V4, which is something that was discussed. I think it was by Cameron something. He didn't want that to happen, but that would be maybe the last step. And DNS might be part of the last step. So for example, when you're getting a request for record, and if you're doing an any request or root request, you shouldn't have in the answer all the v4 information if you know in advance that you don't need it. So I thought it was an interesting concept. So personally, I think you should be continuing to discuss this in Sunset 4, actually.
Okay.
This would be better.
I think the other thing is, we've talked on and off within this group and also within DHC, as we've talked when we did the joint meetings with DHC, that the presence of DNS servers and DHCP servers and other things like that, you have a number of different control surfaces where you can kind of give hosts information about what they should use for different address families, because you have the situation where you can have V6 only plus a V4 transition technology, dual stack with native of both addresses, dual stack with CGN, V4 only, and in a lot of cases, depending on how you're providing those different technologies, there may be a preference for the either from the service provider or from the customer or the hosts or whatever on the network that needs to know which of those services they should use for which types of traffic. And so there's probably a tie-in there as far as DNS is concerned, especially if you're thinking about DNS 6.4 or whatever. And I think I've provided comments to that effect on the list. But that's certainly something that fits within our area of focus. So unless there are other comments on the stuff we've talked about so far, the other thing I wanted to bring up here was there's been a conversation between the working group chairs of V6 Ops and Sunset 4, with some AEs copied, about this idea of IPv4 as a service. You can see the premise here. And of course, because this is a slide I lifted from Fred Baker, it's focused on the operational side of this because V6 Ops is an operationals working group. But there may be more to it than that. There may actually be some additional protocol standardization work or other things like that that makes it a better fit here. And so I am curious to see what people think, either ADs or otherwise, about where this belongs and whether it's interesting work.
Lee Howard, not an AD, but co-chair of V6 Ops. I'm going to read a sentence from each of the charters to say why I asked the question about whether this work was appropriate in V6 Ops or in Sunset 4. So the V6 Ops charter says that we develop guidelines for the operation of a shared IPv4, IPv6 internet and provide operational guidance on how to deploy IPv6 into existing IPv4 only networks. The Sunset 4 charter says talks about the ability of IPv6 only portions of the internet to continue to connect with portions of the internet that remain IPv4 only. So there's a difference there between adding V6 to existing V4 networks and running a V6 only network with some kind of transition technology. That's what the two charters look like when I put them next to each other, which is why I asked the question. And it's more about, I think, when I look at my ADs, I think it's more about what's the intent than what are the actual words. Let's not get stuck in where should the work be done because of what the words say. Let's make sure that we agree with what the working groups want to do. Let's follow the consensus of the working groups and do the work that needs to be done. But let's make sure we have consensus on that.
I'm not wearing the AD hat, but sort of having a little bit of AD experience. I think if you adopted some of this stuff here, it might attract more bodies, and that might be a good thing. So if the V6 ops chairs don't object, that might be a good thing.
Okay. And I would certainly entertain suggestions about whether or not there are additional things to be added to this list. Obviously this is a fairly new discussion, and so there may be additional things that fit here. But if people have questions or comments about this, we certainly have a few more minutes to discuss it. Or independent of that, we have plenty of time for open discussion if you have other things that you think the group should be working on, or if you want to get up to the mic and say, everybody give up and go home, or if you'd like a few minutes to read email in quiet. Yes.
Michael Abramson again. So we're to handle this. This is like we had a discussion before, but is it okay to include in the RA message that there is no IPv4 available on the wire? And there is a big discussion about if this is right or wrong, and it's a matter of a taste and opinion, I would say. I mean, you can be strict about it, you can be pragmatic about it. There is no right answer. So if we think that doing IPv4 as a service is a way of sunsetting v4, then I'm fine with doing this approach. And I think Ted has a point that this might attract more people following this working group, which, yes, it is a good thing.
Okay. And I think to your point about the where you do the shutoff, one of the things that we talked about at some length was the question of where you're going to have devices that will actually understand what you're telling them. You have a device that's IPv4 only, it's not likely to have support for new DHCP-v4 options that tell it to stop talking on IPv4, whereas if you have a device that's dual stack, it's at least somewhat likely that it might support the options in either DHCP-v6 or in ND to know what to do with options that it gets to tell it that there isn't v4 available on the wire. So I think that was kind of why it ended up going that direction ultimately.
Tamon, I think the discussion about V4 as a service is very critical to what we're going to do in this working group, because I think that the major constraints to sunsetting V4 are not going to be necessarily technical, but economic. And so if you're going to do that without lots of backlash, the work on V4 as a service needs to have progressed in a very mature way.
Okay. Another question I would have for the group is does there need to be a use cases document where we talk about the different use cases around IPv4 as a service? I mean, SIIT is in some ways its own use case because it's talking about how to do IPv6 only in a data center, but I'm wondering if there's value in documenting some additional use cases where either IPv6 only is already in use or could potentially be. We had talked about in the no IPv4 draft adding timelines and other things, and it might be more appropriate for that to be in a separate draft where we talk about this stuff a little more generically in terms of ways to transition away and things like that. If people have feelings on that one way or another, please come to the mic.
Tamon no come again. From the gap analysis document, I think it would be good to say for each of the methods we want to say shut down V6, we could link to say a specific use case. Because so if you do action X, here are the implications, and here are the relevant use cases from the V4 as a service that could be used to mitigate it. That would be one way to link both bodies of work.
Thank you. Any other comments or considerations? Lee?
Relaying for Andrew Yurchenko, who I think wants me to relay. He asks, how do dual stack implementations today decide there is no IPv6, and why does this decision process need to be different from the process for IPv4? I think my answer to his question, Lee Howard, my answer to his question is that devices today decide there's no IPv6 because they either don't have any support for IPv6, so they don't know or care, or they don't get an RA, so they say there's no V6. I don't think there's any equivalent in V4 for lack of RAs.
Yeah. Well, and you also have happy eyeballs, which helps to kind of interpret when based on the way that things work.
Michael Abrams, yeah, I seem to remember that there is nothing stopping the device from doing HTTP v6 blindly without seeing an RA, but I am not aware of anyone actually doing that, because, I mean, that would be the equivalent as the IPv4 behavior. And as far as I know, there is nothing in the standard or anything that says that is disallowed. It says if you want to, you can, but nobody does it.
Yeah, oddly enough, I think Windows actually does. We ran into a West George wearing my Time Warner Cable hat. We actually ran into a bug where we had customers that their Windows box was doing DHCP even though it hadn't seen an RA. Yeah, and it was getting an address because we support DHCP v6 PD, but it wasn't getting the default route, and so it wouldn't actually work. And when he was playing with this, he discovered that Linux and OpenWRT and a number of the others don't do that sort of promiscuous mode, and thus it would never start the DHCP process and would never get an address. So I don't think Mac does this. I think it's just Windows, but that was certainly an interesting discovery.
So it received an IANA and nothing else. It had a /128 on the interface and no route or anything.
I think it might have had a 64. Lee, do you remember?
Just only, this actually led to an update of DHCP v6 to increase the RT sol max to make it longer or exponential, if I remember well. Because what they were doing was actually correct according to the RFC. So they actually increased the delay because of that.
Lee Howard, I think what I just heard is yes, such a document would be useful. Describing the use cases for what happens when you're trying to do a no IPv4 network segment.
Okay. So the next piece of that really is if there are people who are interested in working on such a thing, because we of course need authors if we're going to work on a document like that.
Jeff, again, well, the gap analysis actually talks about that. The beginning of the document is about that. So not sure we need more, but that could be discussed.
Okay.
Now relaying a response from Andrew Yurchenko, who points out that in the case we were just talking about, you might have infrequent RAs, and therefore you wouldn't necessarily, how infrequent might they be, therefore resilient RS, so that you can determine, just make it a good decision.
Okay, well, unless there are any other comments or questions for the good of the order, I believe we will declare this closed and give you back some time. If you haven't signed the blue sheets, please do so. Otherwise, someone locate them and bring them back up here so that I can turn them in. And my thanks to all of you who participated and helped out with scribing and note-taking. And with that, I believe we're done. Welcome. Sure. So I mean, usually. Okay.